Most people love to mock idle romance stories. They'll call them unrealistic, delusional, cringe, and parasocial. But if I'm being real, some of the most emotionally devastating love stories I've ever seen come out of that exact space. And I don't think it has anything to do with fame. In my opinion, most people don't actually want the celebrity. They want the feeling attached to them, the feeling of being noticed, chosen, seen by someone who exists completely outside of their world. And idol stories tap into that in a way regular romance can't. That's why people get so emotionally attached to them. That's why they linger. That's why they hurt. And the craziest part, I don't even think these stories are actually about romance. I think they're about access. There are three reasons I've thought of why these stories hit differently. The first is visibility, the second is emotional projection, and the third is the illusion of intimacy. And once you break those down, you start realizing why so many people get emotionally wrecked by these stories without fully understanding why. So let's start with visibility. Because normal romance stories usually ask, will these two people fall in love? But idol romance stories ask something completely different. Should these two people even be near each other in the first place? And that changes everything. Because the emotional tension starts before the romance even exists. The distance is already built into the story. One person is public, one person is watching them from the outside. There are rules, schedules, security, image management. Millions of people projecting onto somebody they'll probably never meet. And somehow, that emotional distance makes the connection feel stronger. Which sounds backwards, I know, but it's true. People always want what feels unreachable, not even romantically, emotionally. That's why these stories hit so hard, because they're built on longing before intimacy ever happens. And I think that's why a lot of regular romance stories feel emotionally flat now. Everything happens too fast. People meet, they flirt, they hook up, done. But idol centered stories force tension to breathe. A glance lasts too long. A moment on stage suddenly feels personal. One tiny interaction becomes emotionally catastrophic because scarcity creates meaning. And fandom culture, which I am still learning about, unintentionally amplifies that. You're already conditioned to notice tiny details, tiny expressions, tiny shifts. So when fiction enters that world, emotional tension becomes microscopic. And weirdly enough, more powerful. The audience isn't chasing the celebrity, they're chasing recognition. Interestingly enough, part of the reason I started thinking about all of this a bit deeply is because I ended up writing a story that lives in this exact emotional space. My novel Faded, which I'm currently querying, follows an idol and a producer, and somewhere near the end of that writing process, I caught myself asking why stories like this affect people so intensely in the first place. Because when you strip away the fame and the fantasy, a lot of these stories are really about emotional distance. And that leads directly into the second reason why these stories hit harder: emotional projection. This is where people usually get uncomfortable because nobody wants to admit that they do this. But everybody projects emotionally onto something: celebrities, characters, relationships, stories, especially when real life feels emotionally disconnected. And I think idol stories become dangerous in a very specific way because they create the illusion of emotional safety. Not real safety, fantasy safety. There's a difference because a person exists far enough away that your brain can fill in the gaps whenever it wants. You don't have to deal with the boring reality of another human being. You deal with the emotionally curated version. And stories take that one step further. Now, suddenly, the fantasy sees you back. That's why these stories feel so intense. Not because people are stupid, not because they're crazy fans, but because emotionally, being chosen by someone emotionally unavailable feels validating in a way a lot of people don't even realize they're craving, especially now. People are lonely, disconnected, exhausted. Everything feels performative all the time. So, stories built around emotional attention become incredibly powerful. What's interesting is, I think that's why so many people become obsessed with slow burns specifically. Because slow burns mimic emotional yearning. The waiting, the restraint, the almost, that anticipation becomes more intimate than the relationship itself sometimes. And K dramas understand this really well, by the way. Way better than most Western romance does. Western romance usually rushes toward payoff. K dramas, they understand the tension. Silence, distance, eye contact, small gestures. The emotional buildup matters more than immediate gratification. That's why people remember one hand touch in a K drama more than entire relationships in other shows. Because emotionally charged restraint is insanely powerful storytelling. Most people don't want fame, they want to feel chosen. And now we get into the part that I think affects people the most: the illusion of intimacy. Because idol culture is built on controlled closeness. That's literally the system. Fan calls, lives, behind the scenes content, eye contact moments during concerts. We miss you, we love you, we're always thinking about you. And logically, most people know it's part performance. But emotionally, your brain still responds to intimacy cues. That's the part people underestimate. Humans are not wired to emotionally separate performance intimacy from real intimacy perfectly, especially repeated intimacy. That's why eye contact during concerts feel insane to people. That's why tiny interactions become core memories. That's why somebody can leave a show genuinely feeling emotionally altered afterward. And honestly, that's why these stories can sometimes feel more devastating than real relationships. Because fantasy intimacy rarely has to survive reality. Reality is messy, awkward, inconsistent. Fantasy intimacy stays emotionally suspended. Perfect tension, perfect longing, perfect possibility, until something breaks it. And when that illusion breaks, people grieve it like it was something real. Because emotionally, parts of it were real. The feelings were real, the attachment was real, the comfort was real, even if the relationship itself never existed. And I think fiction built around this hits people especially hard because it mirrors something a lot of us don't really talk about openly anymore: how badly people want emotional closeness. Not attention, not sex, not validation online. Closeness. Real emotional recognition. And this is the part nobody really talks about. Sometimes people attach themselves to fantasy intimacy because real intimacy feels terrifying. Fantasy can't reject you, it can't betray you. Fantasy can't fully see you either, which is why these stories become both comforting and painful at the same time. And I think that's why idol romance stories linger the way they do. Not because people are delusional, not because they can't separate fiction from reality, but because these stories expose something painfully human underneath all of it: the desire to be emotionally seen by someone who feels unreachable. That's it. That's the core of almost every one of these stories when you strip everything else away. And I don't think there's anything pathetic about that. I think it says something very real about modern loneliness, about emotional distance, and how badly people want connection while simultaneously being terrified of it. Which is probably why the stories that hurt us the most usually aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones, the restrained ones, the almost love stories, the ones built on tension and longing and emotional timing that never quite lines up correctly. Those are the stories people carry for years, not because they were unrealistic, because emotionally they were honest. If you're into stories that explore identity, emotional distance, obsession, longing, and intimacy, all the messy psychological stuff underneath human connection, that's pretty much the kind of world I talk about on my channel all the time, especially through fiction. So if that's your thing, stick around. And now I'd really love to know, what fictional relationship completely wrecked you emotionally? Not necessarily your favorite, the one that stayed with you, the one that felt a little too real.